Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Leah Mix, the CEO of Delphi, and we're so excited to have you here for our monthly insight session. Today, we welcome Melissa Lavasani. Melissa is the founder and CEO of the Psychedelic Medicine Coalition, PMC. This is the only Washington, D.C. based nonprofit that is dedicated to advancing psychedelic-assisted therapies at the federal level. A nationally recognized policy leader, Melissa authored and led the passage of Washington, D.C.'s Initiative 81 and the Entheogenic Plant and Fungus Act of 2020, which passed with 76% voter approval. Motivated by her personal experience using psychedelic medicines to recover from severe postpartum depression, Melissa has become a leading voice for evidence-based mental health policy and for changing the national narrative around psychedelics from counterculture to credible healthcare. Under her leadership, PMC has built bipartisan support in Congress and advanced key federal legislation through the Congressional PATH Caucus, including the Innovative Therapies Centers for Excellence Act and the Expanding Veterans Access to Emerging Treatments Act, which we're going to be discussing today. So amazing work, Melissa. So great to have you with us here today, especially at this time in your journey and PMC's development. There's just so many exciting things happening. So I think our audience is going to be really interested in hearing a bit more about, your background, how you gained this expertise, what you're seeing right now, and what you see happening moving forward. We all like to hear a little bit of forecasting from people who are on the ground and have the expertise to speak to it. So thanks again for being with us. And, I really would like to just start. You've had the opportunity to speak about this, but I think it's really good level setting. You had your own experience with postpartum depression that really brought you to psychedelics. And I'm wondering if you can share how that experience shaped not just your interest in psychedelics, but your commitment to doing this in a serious and evidence-driven way, because that is consistently what PMC is about, how you show up. So how do you go from I'm using these for myself to this has got to be serious healthcare?
Yeah, well, I'm so grateful to be here, Leah. Thank you. And I'm excited to get into all this with you and hear from your audience as well. So it's an interesting trajectory in my life. Absolutely. I'd never expected to be working on the issue of psychedelics. I'd never had any real experience working with these medicines in a serious way or really in any recreational way either. Like I never had them before. And my exposure to psychedelics was truly through an act of desperation. I was working for DC government at the time, working in budget and finance policy for the city of Washington, DC. I'd been doing that for almost 10 years. I'd been in Washington, DC for 21 years, working in various roles in and around government. But my experience with postpartum, while that had nothing to do with my career, it was really like mind altering in its own way. I never really had to navigate the healthcare system that we have in this country in the way that I had to when I was dealing with postpartum. I was really left with a lot of questions more than solutions, which, now that I've dug much deeper in the space, there's a lot of like structural issues that are wrong with our healthcare system. And I think my postpartum depression brought me to that question, but it didn't necessarily give me the answer. What I had to do, I didn't qualify for any clinical trials when I was going through this, and I found out that psychedelics were being studied at Johns Hopkins, Harvard, Stanford, all of these amazing, reputable institutions. And I think that's really what, in my mind, gave me the green light to say, okay, there's some credibility to this thing. This is not like some hokey hippie cure. This is very real if Johns Hopkins is putting their name on something like this. So my approach was to resolve this issue that I had in my life that I could not get solutions for within our healthcare system. I didn't qualify for any of the clinical trials that were going on. There was only really one that was open at the time. It was for treatment-resistant depression. I had to fail on 2 different medications to qualify for that, which I didn't have the time for. I had a brand new baby. I had a toddler. I had my own career and my marriage. So it was really life-altering, this experience. So I ended up growing mushrooms in my closet. I created a little lab in there. Well, my husband was a very integral piece of this because he, in a former life, was a psychonaut in his party days, had a lot of experience with psychedelics. And I really think that's what really helped me find the solution was his guidance through this process. He was super familiar with the psychedelic experience, knew how to navigate through difficult moments, what we now call adverse events, but very fortunate to have somebody as a partner that really knew how to handle something like this and understood the seriousness of all this. So I think that when got through this experience and I tried psilocybin mushrooms on my own, I did it with the intention of like, I just need to get better. Like, I just need to get my life back. And there's definitely is a sense of urgency when you're suffering that you have, but very fortunate that I had the support systems that I had in place. Like I had the security of like owning my own home and not worrying about a landlord coming in and seeing I had illegal drugs. Like that's like reality for people. I had the security of having a supportive partner, the security of having a boss at the time who was a young mother and knew that I was dealing with postpartum and was covering for me. I always tell people if I was in any other position that I had in my career, I probably would have been fired. I was very lucky to have a boss like that was really covering for me because when depression or any kind of mental health episode starts, it consumes your entire life and it impacts everything and all the people around you. So I knew that when I got out of that experience, like this was this there's something here. I wanted to pursue it, and that's how I fell into the opportunity of starting Initiative 81 and getting that across the finish line, which was a really amazing experience. You raised a lot of awareness in Washington, D.C., which was a demographic of folks that no one had really talked to about psychedelics before. So for many people, of course, knew what psychedelics were, but didn't really know what was going on institutionally at the universities, didn't really know that psychedelic compounds were going at the very beginning at the time we're going through the FDA process. I got PMC to the place where we were talking about healthcare and it was really driven by my having conversations with folks in Washington, D.C. I saw people were desperate for something that could work. I think so many people have tried to navigate through, especially our mental health care system, and feeling like we're just guinea pigs trying different medications out and seeing what'll work. And if something does work, for a lot of folks, it helps minimally and it didn't really resolve the core of the problem. So my experience was really shaped by a lot of the conversations I was having with everyday Americans that were here and we're just learning that psychedelics could be a real thing. I do think I've come to this place where we really only focus on healthcare just because I know that there is a very big unmet need in our society right now. And sometimes it can feel really urgent, but urgency and rushing forward through and possibly putting policies forward that haven't necessarily been thought out can exacerbate that vulnerability with people and cause more harm. So my experience the last 6 years in this space almost shaped my sense of responsibility more than anything else. It made me really deeply cautious about how we offer up narratives about transformation in people's lives. I say this about myself too. I always preface my story like, yes, I grew mushrooms in my house. Yes, I did this on my own. I didn't do it under medical supervision. I was, in fact, lying to a lot of my doctors about what I was doing because I was so terrified to tell them I was doing this. But I always tell people it's worked for me. I cannot guarantee it works for you. I think the safest way to do this is through the healthcare system where it's backed by clinical data. It's delivered through real world systems. And once we get to that point, we can start thinking about how we broaden access. But at this point in time, I'd love to move cautiously forward in a very incremental way because I just think that's the safest way to do this.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, what a great answer. That really shows the full arc of it. And I know it's a deeply personal story, and it's
Yeah.
also not an uncommon story that we hear about
No.
people being failed by our medical system, needing to take matters into their own hands. And
Hmm.
one of the things that I'm hearing in that you have a front row seat
Yeah.
to legislators and what's
Right.
happening and how they respond to
Yeah.
different messages. So what I'm hearing you say is that the healthcare policy evidence based conversation is really what moves
Yeah.
policy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really surprising to me. I felt like the big lift was going to be convincing people that psychedelics were okay. And I think at the beginning, there was a lot of like, well, what does MDMA do? And it was just like defining things for congressional office. When PMC started in January 2021, there was very few conversations that were being had about psychedelics. A lot of staffers didn't even know that FDA trials were going on with psychedelic compounds. So I thought that like this is going to be so hard to convince folks that this is a promising treatment. But I think once the veteran narrative started to come into Washington, D.C. We've got the veterans community to thank for that, for sure. They certainly opened up a lot of doors that could have been opened, but opened much more easily with veteran stories. The conversation pretty quickly turned to what are the institutional constraints here? Congressional staff aren't really necessarily like sitting around thinking, well, this is promising or this is not promising. They're thinking about the how and how we navigate this. Like they're thinking about jurisdiction and budgets and liability and agency authority and procurement rules and workforce capacity. And of course, political timing is a very big part of all this as well. So that's been a piece of it. And going into this, it's like, okay, I just need to persuade them that this is something that's okay for them. But what I learned was my main job is to really translate for congressional offices. So you're taking an emerging science and translating it into something that fits within existing regulatory structures, reimbursement structures, and traditional healthcare flows. You're not necessarily convincing people that something is interesting. You're showing how it can be implemented without breaking the machinery of federal healthcare. From a congressional office perspective, they got to think about how do we fit this into our system. We're not going to completely overhaul the healthcare system with psychedelics. That would be like a total pipe dream that would take decades to get done. And I acknowledge our healthcare system is absolutely broken, but how do we incrementally move forward with this and shift from the storytelling to system design? And that's where I think the work has matured a lot.
Yeah, amazing. So I hear what you're saying. I think it's one of the most critical points that defines and sets PMC apart. So there's a big difference, as you've talked about many times, between raising awareness, which is
Hmm.
absolutely essential,
Hmm.
and then actually having the conversations and knowing what information Congress and other kind of incumbent decision makers need to have. And that seems to be the niche role that
Yeah.
PMC is playing.
We talk a lot about how the medicine is just one thing and the integration is the thing that makes you better. It's similar policy wise too. The integration of this into our like American infrastructure is the critical piece here. Awareness absolutely has to be there. We need the attention. We need the capacity for congressional offices to have these conversations. But this can only function properly within healthcare if the infrastructure's there is built to support it. So you can have enormous public excitement for this. Like we've seen it within the veteran community. They're so excited about psychedelics. They're going to Mexico. There's organizations that are set up to set up scholarships for folks to get access to this therapies. But ultimately, you can have that excitement and you can still have zero safe access to this if you haven't built the proper lanes that you need to build within healthcare. So clinician training, protocols, tracking systems, oversight, reimbursements. Without those things, you really just have one giant unregulated experiment. That's not necessarily what healthcare is, right? And we can agree or disagree on what kind of access and what's best for folks, but for the conversations that I'm having with congressional offices and agency staff, that they're thinking about healthcare. We're going to have FDA approved psychedelics within the next 18 months. We got to figure out what we're missing here and what the gaps are, how we can fill it, what legislation needs to move forward. But I think one of the hardest lessons early on was realizing that visibility can get ahead of the readiness. And in healthcare, that creates a real risk. It's a risk for the patients, it's a risk for clinicians, it's a risk for policymakers. We don't want to pressure them into putting forward legislation that will put patients in risky positions. For PMC, we always want to have our posture being build the system first and think about how we scale and grow access later on, which is a hard place to reside, really, because we do have such an urgent need for solutions within mental health care specifically. We got to get psychedelics through the finish line, and it's going through the FDA process on its own. And we don't really engage with FDA. I think that if there was ever opportunity to do FDA reform, we would handle that on the congressional side. But we got to be sure for this issue to be properly implemented in our healthcare system, and we want it to endure, and these medicines to be continuously researched, and we're continuously finding solutions, and with what what psychedelics can do. I want these medicines to be available in 20, 30, 40 years. And if we want that, we got to be sure that we're going about this the right way.
Amazing. And of course, you're really speaking our language here at Delphi. We believe in the things that you're saying. I I think you're really just showing right now why you are considered a voice of reason on the Hill. That is your reputation, balanced understanding
Yeah.
of what's
Yeah.
feasible and how to move things forward
Yeah.
in an incremental way that takes into consideration the government's what they can do and what they can't do safely.
Right.
And that always public safety and balancing that with the need and the research, the evidence, and that triangulation. You have a mastery of that, and it's so important for the field. I think that there's a kind of a global way that you're operating from that place. And then also we see PMC being very tactical, right?
Mhm.
So I want to just like talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
We've seen some really meaningful movement recently around veterans focused legislation. And you mentioned
Mhm.
the veterans were so grateful for how
Mhm.
they have shown up.
Mhm.
And this legislation that PMC has been championing includes the expanding veteran access for emerging therapies act, which was a bit
Yeah.
of a surprise from Representative Bergman. You
Yeah.
have a story about that, I'm sure. But
Yeah.
from your perspective, why is this different? Why is this moment different? And what makes this approach more viable than past efforts or more viable in this moment?
Yes, well, it's certainly the timing of the bill introduction was we knew the bill was underway. We didn't know the timing, but the two chairs of the PATH Caucus, Lou Correa and Jack Bergman, they spoke. PMC hosted an event a few weeks ago. PMC acknowledges the moment is absolutely different because we are on the cusp of FDA approvals. We have an insane unmet clinical need inside one of the most conservative healthcare institutions in the country, which is the VA. And the VA is a very interesting place to start with psychedelics. I think it's the perfect place to start with psychedelics because it's not just a healthcare delivery, it's so many other things. It's a fully integrated healthcare system. It delivers the care, it trains the clinicians, it does research, it tracks outcomes, and it operates at a national scale. So I always tell people we're not a veteran organization. Our goal is to create safe, affordable access for everybody in the United States with psychedelics. But I always say that healthcare for everyone starts at the VA, and that's a statement that I always stand behind. Something can be evaluated rigorously and implemented responsibly at the VA with real patients and real clinicians and longitudinal data. It becomes credible for the rest of the healthcare ecosystem. So I think Bergman's legislation is just the starting point, what this can look like and how we can scale this in our healthcare system. It's really about a structured evaluation of how psychedelics perform in a healthcare system. But this bill is great because it mandates the VA to do this work. It creates pathways for controlled pilots, it's institutional oversight, it's workforce development, it's real world evidence generation. And also, on top of that, because there is an urgent unmet need, Bergman is thinking really creatively about how we create access within the VA that's not necessarily tied to a clinical trial, as a lot of people know that clinical trials are really rigorous and comorbidities eliminate a lot of folks from getting access to psychedelics within clinical trials, which I still believe is one of the safest way to currently access psychedelics is through a trial, just because of the oversight there and how rigorous they are. But Bergman's bill creates an on-ramp for veterans to access psychedelics under medical supervision within the VA. I think because so many folks in the veteran community are leaving the country, that's created a really terrible problem for the VA. And this is a way to capture those patients and bring them back into the system while continuing to move this issue forward within the VA and also collect data on the folks that are accessing outside of a trial. So I think this is the starting point of what this looks like in that organization.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Yeah, so those are all such critical pieces that need to be built and developed for this to
Hmm.
become healthcare. And I want to get into some future looking things, but I just want to
Yeah,
note how strategic this is because you have been deeply involved in advancing the Innovation Therapy Centers for Excellence Act, which actually
yeah,
started before this new act. So
yeah,
this
yeah.
is a way to get forward momentum with
Hmm.
the VA while we move towards something larger
Hmm.
with centers for excellence. So very tactical, very
Yeah.
strategic, and just want to acknowledge how important that is to be able to
Hmm.
be nimble in relationship
Yeah.
to the government.
You
This is
have
what
to
it looks
be.
like, right?
Yes, yes, yes. It's
So
not necessarily like what I need to have. It's like what needs to happen with the current system that's in place. I have my own personal opinions about psychedelics that I don't always share with folks, but that's not PMC's job to put my personal opinion and create that into policy. It's like, what can we practically do right now?
so incredible. Keep our eye on all of that, and thank you
Yeah.
so much for what you're doing to move it forward. In
Uh-huh.
the next year, I feel like you have some big things teed up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'd love to hear what you're feeling most excited about over the next year or so.
For this year, PMC's focus is going to be like intentionally narrow. We've got the Centers of Excellence bill, which is complementary to the Bergman bill, which is creating that mandate. I think of the Centers of Excellence as the structure that the emerging therapies bill is the meat of it. Like you have the skeleton and then you have the muscle are there. They work in tandem with each other and are really great companions to each other. So we're trying this year focusing on moving bipartisan legislation forward. We are also looking at public education. I think public education is really critical to making sure that patients are safe, that the healthcare system itself is knowledgeable about this, and continuing to develop our institutional partnerships. We're not necessarily like trying to solve every problem at once. I think the ecosystem is so small and there's so many things that we need to tackle. It can almost be paralyzing at times, but now that we have Congress in this point where they're ready to start legislating in a real way, we got to ensure that that's done right and we're bringing the right champions onto this issue, but also doing the other work of how do you address this with the public? That's one thing the ecosystem hasn't quite done yet, is really providing a baseline of education. Like what I did with Congress in 2021, we need to do at a much larger scale for the American population because there's this assumption that because there's been a couple of big pieces of news that have come out about psychedelics, we just assume everyone kind of gets it. And of course, a lot of the folks within the ecosystem have their own personal experiences and they those can be really profound. It certainly was profound for me, but we also have to remember we're dealing with a very diverse country in so many different ways, racially, socioeconomically. How do we get people to a point where they have a baseline of knowledge about what psychedelics are and what to expect from this experience? So I think public education, and we have our federal summit that we hold on May 14th, bringing together the stakeholders together and to talk about where does our attention need to go right now. So I'm very excited for that. Our work is always not like the sexiest work. Yeah, I feel like our press hits are genuinely earned. But where PMC is really valuable is the day-to-day conversations that we have with the administration, with the Congress, with the entire Washington, D.C. ecosystem. That's really important to get buy-in from all kinds of folks that operate in the city.
I'll have to say that maybe I'm strange, but I was so blessed to attend the last summit and it was very sexy. It was
Sexy
incredible
for
and
nerds.
like absolutely packed. So I'm very excited for the continuation, the expansion. I know that's probably going to be a larger event this year
Yeah.
and just being able to get decision makers and advocates and researchers all in the same room to move those important conversations forward. And I know that the type of education that you're producing is the
Mhm.
type that the government, while it can't say it itself right now, like
Mhm.
usually when policy gets passed and implemented, like Samson, the government itself can provide
Right.
appropriate education. We're just in that gap. We're in
Yeah.
that time of things are changing. The government can't
Mhm.
do that work, but it needs to be
Right.
done. And so
Right.
PMC steps in and fills that role in a way that the government's probably going to be thankful for and comfortable with, and also that's going to provide really important foundational education for the public to know
Right.
what's coming and to prepare. So that's all super exciting. Just going to
Yeah.
ask you a quick quick crystal ball question.
Yeah.
If everything went really well, the right guardrails, right evidence, the right bipartisan alignment, everything, what would you see success looking like for psychedelic policy in the next
Yeah.
5 years?
I think people might not like my answer, but I would love psychedelics to become boring. Like, I would love to not see these sensational headlines of like, oh my God, this is going to transform society. I want it to be very grounded in reality. I think that's when it can move through our healthcare system without any kind of hype cycle. Because I think the hype cycle is good for bringing attention to things for sure, but I would love these therapies to be integrated. Obviously, FDA approvals underway. I could see that's a easy thing to predict in 5 years. I would love these to be prescribed cautiously and delivered by properly trained clinicians. I would love much more basic scientific data, but also longitudinal data and real world data. And I would like legislation and policies to just be adaptable as the evidence evolves. I think the real win here is the legitimacy of all this. Psychedelics will stop being treated as a cultural phenomenon and start being treated as regulated clinical tools. And if that's the case, that's what I consider a success.
Awesome. May it be so.
Yes.
Yeah, and thank you for your work towards that. I also think that that sounds great.
Yeah.
Psychedelics are boring. They're so commonplace. They're so safe.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, amazing. So we have a few questions in the chat. I want to get through these in for
Okay.
Q&A. So this is from Eric Bailey, a well-known expert in the substance use disorder industry, especially on the
Hmm.
payer side. So this is a well-informed question. With
Hmm.
respect to your advocacy work with PMC and
Hmm.
looming FDA approval for psychedelic compounds that you've mentioned, are there any healthcare systems that you've encountered who are particularly receptive to creating the infrastructure that's necessary to incorporating these medicines into their existing systems, both from a service delivery and a reimbursement perspective? So besides the VA, any other healthcare systems that you've been aware of who've been stepping forward with some interest or champions coming forward?
So I think systems that are comfortable with piloting new models of care like psychedelics are in a controlled way, rather than jumping right into commercialization. I think academic medical centers are often most engaged early on, definitely within the psychedelic ecosystem. They've been truly forging ahead with the research, and Johns Hopkins University initiated all of this. So I think the academic medical centers are one of the most promising places because they already have institutional review boards, they have the clinical trial infrastructure, they have experience integrating investigational therapies into existing care pathways, and they're thinking about things like clinician credentialing and liability frameworks and data capturing and how all of these interventions fit within existing psychiatric and behavioral care. From a reimbursement perspective, I think the systems taking this seriously are not assuming immediate payer coverage. They're planning probably for a period where delivery looks more like a hybrid between research and specialty care, with potentially bundle payment models or alternative reimbursement pilots, or even grant supported programs filling gaps until there's is enough real world evidence to support broader coverage decision. And I don't want folks to be like, disappointed when I do think these are going to be expensive in the beginning. I think over time that cost will be continuing to drive down. The VA is again a useful reference point, not because it's representative of any kind of private healthcare, but it shows what institutional seriousness looks like. It's a system that can evaluate the therapies end to end and has clinical protocols, workforce training, ethical oversight, long-term outcomes, and cost effectiveness all in one integrated structure. I think that all of these systems are thinking about what's it actually going to take to do this safely, legally, and sustainably.
I think that that's right. It's a great segue actually to the next question because
Yeah.
of who asks the next question. The next person answering this question has actually just successfully created a stop loss plan to financially de-risk employers covering
Okay.
ketamine therapy in preparation for psychedelic assisted therapy. And that
Okay.
is Alan Ritterhold. Alan is asking, since many VA members are still covered under the employer sponsored plan, are there thoughts for a framework of education and sharing of information between public and private? And so basically talking about all of that information that you say that can be generated in the VA, how are we going to extract? Will we be able to like extract that so that the other healthcare systems can learn from it? I think that's the essence of that question.
Yeah, another excellent question. Thank you, Alan, for always asking the right questions. It's super important. I think a significant number of veterans receive care across multiple systems. It's not just at the VA. There's the employer-sponsored insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, and there's so many meaningful innovations inside the VA. They can't stay isolated there, so it creates a definite interface. So the way I think about it is less public versus private. It's more as institutional learning transfer, maybe. The VA is really uniquely positioned to generate high quality data, not just with clinical outcome workforce models and safety protocols. So I think the most realistic framework isn't necessarily immediate policy harmonizing, but it's structured knowledge sharing. So I think that this piece of it is going to look a little different. It's going to have standardized data reporting that's publishable. It's going to have clinical guidelines are developed. And once these therapies demonstrate real world value inside systems like the VA, that evidence can become a foundation for private payers to justify that coverage. So the bridge between public and private isn't built necessarily through advocacy alone. We need the evidence there, and it can't just be anecdotal. It can't just be advocates talking about this. So that evidence portability is what we're making sure what we learn in public systems is rigorous, transparent, and I think transferable. So you can avoid kind of this fragmentation and create a healthcare pathway that's coherent and cohesive across the entire system.
Great. So hopefully we can expect some of this information to be transferred out into the public domain and
Yeah.
become useful as it's developed. We're not there yet. Let's try and get in a couple more questions. There's some really
Okay.
good ones. So this one is related to the administration. This is from
Okay.
someone anonymous. In this administration, it appears many times that the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. For example, despite rhetoric about psychedelics from senior public figures, the White House is either silent or not on board. For example, this person just saw today that Compass Pathways was denied fast track for psilocybin by the White House
Yeah.
after the FDA had moved
Yeah.
forward. So what are your
Right.
strategies given these challenges?
Honestly, I don't think what's happening now is any different than what happens all the time in government. And I don't think that's a product of this administration. That's unique to this administration, I should say. I think what is getting described here and what the press has really kind of honed in on recently is a reflection of how our large federal system actually functions. There's not one single decision maker here that can flip the switch on psychedelics. It's a network of agencies with different kind of mandates and jurisdiction and evidentiary thresholds and risk tolerances. And so I think it's very normal for different parts of the government system to move at different speeds and say one thing and potentially contradict in another area of government, especially when it comes to an emerging therapy area like psychedelics. The FDA is a very specific role. They're evaluating safety and efficacy. The White House, on the other hand, is always looking much broader at a different set of considerations. Like political risk is a much bigger thing at the White House. Political risk is a thing that doesn't exist at the FDA. And then from our perspective, like the question isn't necessarily why isn't everyone aligned? Because I don't think everyone's ever aligned in government on anything. It's just how do you build that alignment in this system that is really structurally fragmented by design? So our strategy has been just focus on the pieces of government that are structurally responsible for long-term health implementation. So that's why VA, NIH, CMS, and FDA itself, these institutions operate on evidence and not necessarily rhetoric, and ultimately determine whether something becomes real or healthcare stays theoretical. I think RFK Jr. has taken a lot of heat because he came out really hot and said, I mean, we're going to get this in the hands of veterans. But they cannot single-handedly do that on their own. They need congressional buy-in. They need VA's buy-in. They need the White House's buy-in. So when a system is this large, progress is like never linear. It's completely incremental, and sometimes these jumps from point A to point B are bigger than others and or sometimes smaller than others. So we're not necessarily chasing the alignment, but what we're trying to do is build the coherence at the
Yeah.
institutional level where the healthcare happens.
Totally. And you're doing an amazing job. I think one of the challenges that I perceive is other administrations tend to hold things a little bit closer to the vest,
Yeah.
whereas this administration tends to allow folks to be more outspoken, to be more
Hmm.
public with their
Hmm.
opinions or what they think is going to happen. And so
Yeah.
then the public gets kind of caught in what is often happening behind closed doors before it's made public. So I think that's also part of the challenge that we're
Absolutely.
experiencing.
Yeah.
I want to end on a question from Marcina Hale. Uh, just to end on a different note, Melissa, how do you believe psychedelics are related to spirituality? And if so, how does that integrate into a medical system that does not work with that integration in their sphere of knowledge?
Yeah. Oh, I always get asked how we integrate spirituality into our advocacy, and not that I don't think it's important. I know my own spiritual pathway personally has been completely strengthened by my experiences with psychedelics. So I do acknowledge that these things are connected. But I think from PMC's perspective, it's really important that we separate the two things, like the subjective experiences people basically report from their psychedelic experiences and the way healthcare systems are structured and how they evaluate and deliver the treatment, right? So many people who've used psychedelics will describe experiences as spiritual, existential, most meaningful experience of their life. That's very profound, and it's well documented in actual trials. So it is a very real thing. But from a medical system perspective, those experiences aren't treated as a spiritual truth. They're treated more as like a psychological phenomenon that may or may not have a therapeutic relevance. I think healthcare doesn't really operate on that kind of framework. It operates on kind of symptom reduction, functional improvement, very boring things. So the way I see this integrating into medicine is not by importing spirituality into clinical care, but translating subjective experiences into clinical, meaningful constructs.
Mm,
Um, I think things changes in depression severity, right? Shifts in cognitive flexibility, improvements in emotional processing. In other words, what I'm trying to say is medicine doesn't need to necessarily validate a spiritual interpretation in order to evaluate the therapeutic effect of it. So I think there's some language that is going to become more prevalent within our healthcare system that's going to be helpful in kind of framing those types of experiences. Um, so I don't think healthcare needs to necessarily absorb the spiritual elements of this, but what it needs is really strong professional standards that allow patients to interpret their experiences in their own way. Because every person doesn't approach psychedelics and have the same experience. A multitude of people that believe in all kinds of faiths can have various different kind of like spiritual experiences. So it's going to look different for each person. As long as those professional standards are there, the system itself can remain grounded in the evidence, safety, and outcomes. And I think that's kind of how medicine's always handled experiences that are kind of subject, like from pain to trauma or grief. The system itself doesn't necessarily need to define that meaning. It just needs to know whether an intervention helps people function better, suffer less, and stay safe over time.
yeah, so this reminds me like of best practices in integration is not putting meaning onto something, but holding
Right.
space for meaning
Right.
to be made.
Exactly.
And structurally, I agree with you. As a behavioral health clinician, I administered biopsychosocial assessments, which do include learning about and recognizing the spiritual aspects of a person's life and
Yeah.
identity. And so structurally, some of those pieces are already there, but I think what
Right.
you're bringing forward is really important, that it's going to be up to the field to
Yeah.
how this is brought in without putting upon what the spiritual practice is or what it should be, but
Yeah.
creating a container and a space for them
Yeah.
to have and make
Right.
meaning of what they may experience as spiritual experiences. I really appreciate that answer. We are so grateful for this conversation today, Melissa, and for all of the work that you're doing on behalf of the field. It is just such a pleasure to talk with you and to be in collaboration with you.
Oh, thank you, Leah. And I appreciate the audience. Thanks for sticking with us. And thank you for the excellent questions. Please reach out to me, Melissa at psychedelic-medicine-coalition.org, and follow us on social media if you want to further this conversation.
Thanks everyone for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next month for the Delphi Insight session.